Hello, hello, and welcome to the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I'm joined by Mr. Hermann Pretorius. Hermann, how you doing, man?
I am well, thanks. And it's been a while since I've been on the show with Chris. So I don't know what I did wrong, but I apologize, Nick.
Yeah, no, that's entirely accidental, I'm afraid. So there's no delicious conspiracies to uncover here. Certainly not none. Don't look any further. And of course, we also have Mr. Chris Hattingh. Chris, how are you doing?
Nicholas and Herman doing well, thanks. Oh, we can talk about gatekeeping and classical liberalism later on in the show. We'll get there, Herman.
That's
And
a that's a
conspiracy.
that's a 45-minute discussion by itself, if not longer.
Only. Okay.
I just want to also quickly, before we start off, I don't know if I've actually ever clarified this on the show, but the show goes out in a number of formats. We have our YouTube version, of course, which is broadcast live at 1:30 Monday to Thursday. Then we also have the audio-only version, which goes up a little bit after 4:30. And you can also hear us on Cliff Central, which broadcasts around about 4:30 as well. So yeah, if you're wondering when we sort of actually start and go out, YouTube is first at 1:30, and then we do the recorded versions go out a little bit later. Anyway, with that admin out of the way, let us get into the news of today. And there wasn't too much, I think, that really excited our imagination today, but there were a couple of things that we thought were kind of interesting. So one of the things we've been talking about a lot recently is rail in South Africa, because it's becoming increasingly apparent that South Africa's rail infrastructure is far more important, I think, than many people realize to the way that the country works, both on a freight side, but also on a passenger side. Well, it's clear that the Department of Transport is also recognizing this problem, because they have issued a white paper on national rail policy, and they say that the Gautrain system has been very successful and that it should be basically replicated in other provinces. So they're identifying a couple of areas where they think there should be major routes. We have a route. They're suggesting a route between Cape Town and the Winelands, a route on the Durban Metro and surrounding areas, a route between Gauteng and Polokwane. So presumably, Tiago, who was on the show yesterday, will be able to come and visit us more easily if such a thing is built. A route between Gauteng and Rustenburg, and one operating through the Eastern Cape from Mthatha to East London to PE/Gqeberha. So I think it's an interesting idea. I think, Gautrain has proven that it can, get the job of being a rail network done. But there are a couple of concerns. The first one is another story I saw at the same time, which is that the Western Cape train services today are being disrupted due to vandalism and the stealing of power cables, copper cables, and the destruction of infrastructure. So I guess there's a number of questions. And Herman, let me start with you. Firstly, this train system, is it affordable? Is it sustainable, as in, like, it's not going to just all be vandalized and stolen? And is it actually what we need for transport, or should we do something as an alternative to building Gautrains all over the place? What do you make of this, Herman?
Well, I mean, there are a few ways to skin this cat. Firstly, one needs to point out that the route between Pretoria and Johannesburg is something difficult to replicate elsewhere. There's a lot of residential and professional cross travel that really just existed when the route came into being and allowed it to immediately have a market, as it were. Between Cape Town and the Winelands, I'm not so sure, and between the other options in the Eastern Cape and in KwaZulu-Natal, I'm also not sure whether those the unique circumstances of two big cities close enough to each other to practically allow people to reside in the one and work in the other. So you need sort of these two tick boxes, or at least three. You need two big cities. The cities need to be big enough to have residential capacity in both directions and professional capacity and commercial capacity in both directions. So it's actually quite difficult for those circumstances to be replicated elsewhere. But then you get into the sort of the more obvious question that one needs to ask of Fikile Mbalula. It's just like, how about we just, try to potty train before we do a PhD? The South African railroad system is in a disastrous state. I mean, one of my favorite jokes, and buckle up for this one, is the biggest problem with the thieves of the railroad network is they leave no tracks. So we are literally in a country where the infrastructure is so badly maintained and the security is so lackluster that even your most basic cargo trains, actually more important to the economy than moving skills between municipal centers, is just going up in smoke. I spoke to a railroad engineer 2 years ago, I think, who said that over the last decade, South Africa has slipped 90 million tons in terms of what should actually be shipped on our railroad network. We should, for argument's sake, be able to transport 200 million tons, and our network is only able to carry 110 million tons. So it's before we get to fancy speed trains, and I think whatever Cyril Ramaphosa has, it's catching, because if you think you're going to build a smart city without being even able to maintain an existing relatively dumb city, you're really into the weeds. So a final point perhaps on this is, yes, the Gautrain is perhaps successful, and perhaps if it can be replicated, it should, but it's also a public-private partnership. It's not fully state-controlled. So this is clearly sort of a tacit, or either a tacit or an ignorant admission of state failure and governmental failure here by the department. And then, of course, most of these trains, they need electricity to run. And I'm not sure whether we have enough of that at the moment.
So, Chris, one thing that's always bothered me a little bit about the Gautrain, and I was young at the time that it actually came into being, but I remember at the time it was criticized by some people for being basically something that was kind of nice to have, but really honestly not that important, because it would be too expensive for most people to use and to get involved with. And we've seen that with the Gautrain. It's unaffordable to people outside of the middle class, and it carries mostly tourists and people going, either students going to Pretoria or people going to the airport, right? Those are some of the big routes that people go on. And I see a little bit of that sort of, so there's this, I think there's competing ideas of what the Gautrain system, or its what versions of it might be like in the future. The one idea is that it's like a sort of tourism, high, middle class, expensive, like almost luxury public transport system. And then on the other, it's a sort of new mass transit system. And in the proposed routes here, it kind of seems like the government is still quite not sure which one to go on here. So, I mean, I don't know how many tourists are going to Mthatha or East London, but maybe there'd be some. But that route seems like it would be more useful to just ordinary South Africans kind of moving around. Same with from Gauteng to Rustenburg. But Cape Town to the winelands, that seems like something very much for tourists. And I'm sure the government would say, oh, well, why can't we have both? But I don't know. What do you make of this kind of confusion of what Gautrain should be? Shouldn't we just spend money on the other rail infrastructure that we already have?
Perhaps just protecting the infrastructure that we have before it's all sort of stripped away. I mean, Hermann's point about the tonnage or lesser thereof being moved than before. We've got a commodities boom going. We could be exporting more to the European Union and filling some of the gaps now left by Ukraine and Russia, but we simply aren't, because we can't get through things through ports and across rail. I think the middle class to sort of middle to upper middle class point is well taken, because it's one thing to say you want public infrastructure, but another thing when it's confined to a very small sort of area in the economic heartland of the country kind of thing versus across vast distances. How do you make sure that routes are optimized? How do you make sure that equipment is protected? How do you make sure that passenger sort of numbers match the capital that would be sunk into it? There's a few case studies from China that jump to mind where they tried to artificially engineer consumer demand and activity, and all that infrastructure that's been built now is sort of falling into disrepair and just not being used because it's simply not how people are functioning, no matter how much the bureaucrats try and force things in that way. I think, this to me, I need to get into the details of the white paper in more, sort of read it and analyze it, but it strikes me very much as the sort of localization, idealism plan and the Transnet privatization plan where, yes, we'll get private operators in, it'll be a public-private partnership, let's get investment going, more routes, that sort of thing. But ultimately, Transnet still owns the infrastructure and they're responsible for maintenance. Is there going to be a real investment or upgrading? I don't particularly think so. So this again, maybe just points to the sort of a state running out of actual ideas, workable ideas, and just wanting to grasp and promise things and look for the shiny new toys that they can promise. It's interesting that we've moved so quickly from monumental flagpoles to bullet trains across the country, but there we go. That's our government, I suppose.
One almost gets the feeling that this is a solution in search of a problem in a country with enough problems. So they're really, of course, you want to get people more market access, and you want to, in an economy that's gradually nudging towards, a greater and greater focus on tertiary sector. In other words, financial services, skills development, high skill jobs. You want to get those people to be as mobile as possible, but there are better ways to do that. If, for example, the government were to rather invest in upgrading rural broadband, or in making sure that you have that sort of capacity where you can combine high earning potential with your rural areas where spending potential is needed, that would be a much better solution to get skills to market in a more creative and cheaper and more reliable way.
Do the actual spectrum auction before it gets mired again in court cases and stuff like that. Tell Telkom, take away your court cases kind of thing and have actual cheaper access to broadband, as you rightly say.
With the rise of more and more remote working, we now really have the opportunity to decouple a lot of kind of middle class jobs from any specific geography. You don't have to necessarily have a geographic center of a lot of industries. I mean, for example, we all are spread out all over the country. Yesterday's show was split between Joburg and Polokwane. And if you had great infrastructure, and I've actually been someone who's looked at moving to some of these smaller towns around the country, and one of the big drawbacks is if I wanted to move to these towns, a lot of them just don't have the internet infrastructure to be able to allow me to do my job in the way that I'd want to. So I think that that's a great idea, actually. And as you say, probably a lot cheaper to, I don't know, maybe subsidize fiber operators or something to construct in those areas than it would be to build a very expensive train network that will take a very long time to build, by which time, who knows whether those will still be important routes in the country.
The white paper itself talks of the date of 2050. So I mean, you really need to admire the gumption of an ANC policy document that far into the future, either them existing or the country existing.
Right. If unemployment was below 10%, I'd say, sure, go ahead, guys. But I don't think that this is really going to fix that problem, and we should probably spend the money elsewhere. Okay, let's move on to our next story. This is just kind of, it's interesting, not so much because it's like big news, but because it's symbolic, I think, of what's happened to the ANC. So former ANC NEC member Trevor Manuel, who was once at the heart of government in the Mbeki administration and even remained a cabinet minister for some time after the departure of President Mbeki from power. Trevor Manuel was speaking to Bongani Bingwa on radio this morning, and he said that the ANC has never been the same since the 2007 Polokwane conference when Jacob Zuma became the leader of the ANC. He said that he truly realized how much the ANC had changed from the party that he had loyally been a member of, when he was called a free agent after publicly saying that President Jacob Zuma should pay back the money used for his Nkandla homestead upgrades. He was called a free agent by Gwede Mantashe. He also says that he was very upset by the Gupta plane landing at the Woordkloof Air Force Base. And as a result, he says that in recent years, he's actually let his membership of the ANC lapse, and he's no longer a member of the ANC. So he goes on to say, I was involved with the ANC for a few more years after Polokwane, but in his words, he said, quote, "The magic, the stance of moral leadership that had shaped the ANC through my youth was gone. I think the event of Polokwane took that away." So I think we would definitely have our quibbles with what Mr. Manuel was saying here. But I think it's kind of instructive. This is a guy who really did achieve almost, all of the ANC government's great successes in government. Herman, what are your thoughts on this?
I was just browsing this oldie but a goodie book, Andrew Feinstein's After the Party, where you can't argue with the fact that Manuel was probably the most successful ANC cabinet minister of both the Mandela and Mbeki eras. We're not quite sure what he did during the Zuma era, but he was he was responsible for, wasn't it the National Development Plan or the NDP, and which actually had relatively okay stuff. So let's give him credit and say that the ministerial portfolios that he occupied, he was quite successful in. But I must say, I both agree and disagree with him. Yes, after Polokwane, the ANC changed. But I think if we're going to be honest, it's only the rapidity of change that really changed. Because if you have to go back in a way to the original sin of the ANC, and that is the arms deal, where Trevor Manuel by no means is above reproach or above suspicion or above being associated with those dealings that really laid the groundwork for Mr. Zuma to come in, the fractures in the ANC between Mbeki and Zuma to come in, corruption to take hold on a massive scale within the ANC to such an extent that it became essentially the patronage lifeblood of the whole system. So Mr. Manuel is right, yes. And he has some credibility. Yes, he was a good government minister. South Africa's economy did well when he was Minister of Finance. We had our first ever, since the formation of the union, I think, budget surpluses under his watch, and those budget surpluses funded the social welfare system that as it got started, that's now gotten out of hand. So yes, he was successful, and yes, the party wasn't the same after Polokwane, but the deterioration was the thing that mattered, not the direction of travel. And Mr. Manuel cannot be immunized or declared innocent from those actions going back to the original sin of the arms deal. But it is interesting. It is interesting that this just shows that if I know of no other country where a minister of finance that never rose to the position of head of government as prime minister or president, 15 years after essentially leaving the office for which he was famous, is still politically relevant and sort of current in a way. It just goes to show that the ANC really is in a weird sort of time capsule, that someone like Trevor Manuel is still a big beast. He should be an elder statesman. He should have moved on. He should be the Michael Heseltine of the ANC that you occasionally see on TV doing an interview about, some obscure dimension of policy. But the fact that he is still this presence to be dealt with, that Gwede Mantashe, and that he's still a conversation piece associated with the ANC, shows how much time capsule-like the ANC is, and how it really hasn't brought forth a new Trevor Manuel or someone that could take over from him as the successful minister, as the economics guy within the ANC. It's telling of how shallow the ANC's bench has become.
All right, I think there was very much an attempt to try and cast Pravin Gordhan as the next version of Trevor Manuel, but this time less tainted by the evils of neoliberalism, as the left might describe him. But I don't think that's really worked out, particularly since Pravin has been put in charge of the SOEs, or was for a while, and has I don't think impressed terribly in that position. Chris, what do you make of this? We've been talking a lot about how we think that the ANC is really in trouble at the moment and that it's falling apart. Do you think this is a sign of that, or are we over-interpreting all of this?
I think we give Gordon enough credit to sell SAA for 51 Rand. So, I mean, talk about a neoliberal project. There we go. But him aside, and the ANC more broadly, it's a nice thing to talk about, doing good for the people and your compacts and your grand plans. But to me, morality is often, it boils down to your actions. And we see the morality or lack thereof in the ANC's actions, and the people who run it, in party members across the country, not to say every single one, but on average, what they think of occupying public office, and what they think of taking charge of taxpayer resources, and what they think of trying to deliver service to South Africans who are denied them through colonialism and apartheid. I think the party, all the signs point to its decline, and it's sort of exponentially increasing, how it's trying to grasp for different things and trying to promise all these grand plans and get votes and that sort of thing. But I guess you can't cheat reality. You can only pretend to cheat it for a while, and then the consequences catch up to you. So I think Manuel's comments are well taken, but he doesn't, to me, have a particularly strong footing on which to stand. I guess more history and gravitas in that way, not particularly through his actions of like, oh, look at all what I've done and how I held people to account and all that sort of thing. But the continued fracturing of the party, I think, before our eyes.
Right, and of course, an interesting sort of tangent to this is that I think Trevor Manuel is taking JJ Tabane to court, because JJ Tabane, who's a news anchor on what's that channel called, News Africa?
Newsroom Africa. And if you're going to call JJ Tabane a news anchor, I think you're missing.
Well, opinion anchor, I think, is more accurate.
It's a word that's similar to anchor.
Yeah, let's not go there. JJ Tabane apparently in an interview accused Trevor Manuel of secretly being involved in the formation of COPE and the splitting up, and the first sort of big split in the ANC after Polokwane. And Trevor Manuel's taking him to court over this, saying, this is a lie, this is slanderous, I wasn't involved. But it's quite interesting, actually, because I wonder, if Trevor Manuel had actually sort of defected to COPE after 2007, Herman, do you think it would have made any difference to that party?
It might have done. It might have done in the sense that what really did it for COPE was the fact that they only had two big beasts, and it was a boxing match.
Who didn't get on?
Who didn't get on? So it was between Shilowa and Lakota, and the tension between them personally just destroyed the party from a 7% party on arrival to a 0.7% party where we are today, if they are lucky. So were there some star power if you perhaps had a Tito Mboweni or a Trevor Manuel? It might have been different. But it's a difficult what if to consider. But I must say,
I think Manuel did.
It would be very entertaining if Trevor Manuel's argument in court was, no, I didn't form COPE. Had I formed them, they would be competent.
I think it's also interesting to note that Trevor Manuel probably did provide some legitimacy to Zuma's government in the early years, because remember that Zuma was hailed as a populist man of the people, returned to the roots of the ANC because Thabo Mbeki was so out of touch. And the fact that Trevor Manuel was still involved in government until 2014, which is roundabout when the time that Zuma really started to lose credibility with the kind of mainstream media and those groups. I think that doesn't speak greatly to his ability to his moral strength in this area. Anyway, very interesting nonetheless. Finally, let's move on to a topic which I think only Herman knows really anything interesting about, so we're going to let him talk about it for the next couple of minutes. I think Chris and I might be able to jump in at the end. And this is the Australian election. he's a what's the fancy word for it anyway? Let's not get sidetracked. So, Hermann, there's a big Australian election coming up. You think that it has a very fascinating dynamic. Explain to us what's going on. Who do you think is going to win? All of that good stuff.
Yeah. So, brief overview. Australia has probably one of the most fascinating constitutions in the world. It's a pretty brilliant combination of America and the UK. Pretty deliberate imitation of both those, combining them. So it's got a lot of the good stuff of the British parliamentary system, and it's got a lot of the good stuff of the American federal system. So it's just interesting politics to follow. So on the 21st of May, they will have their next federal election that elects the House of Representatives, equal to the House of Commons in the UK, the lower chamber, but the more powerful chamber, and then also their Senate, which is similar to the House of Lords, which is consultative more than actually, binding. The House of Representatives does take precedent in a way. They have a weird system in Australia where they have federal elections every 3 years. Every 3 years, the House of Representatives is elected anew. That's a very, very short period of time. I think too short. I think if there's one failing in the Australian Constitution, it's probably term. I think you get into trouble if you have terms shorter than 4 years. But I mean, that's a debate for another day, and perhaps not even a debate, just a matter of opinion. So they have the next election on the 21st of May, and it's between Scott Morrison, the incumbent Prime Minister, and Anthony Albanese, the leader of the Labour Party, for who's going to be Prime Minister. Scott Morrison is the leader of the Australian Liberal Party, who is in permanent coalition with the Australian National Party. And I do think that that's a very interesting arrangement where conservatives and classical liberals around the world can sometimes look to find a workable governmental model. But the coalition have been in power now since 2013, if I remember correctly, when Tony Abbott was swept to power in something of a landslide, winning 90 of the 151 seats of the House of Representatives. But since Abbott was, and this is the fascinating thing about Australian politics, Abbott was leader of the party until he was kicked out by Malcolm Turnbull. Then Malcolm Turnbull was kicked out by Abbott, who then became Prime Minister. While Prime Minister, he was kicked out by Malcolm Turnbull, who then became leader of the party and Prime Minister again. Then Malcolm Turnbull was ruffled by supporters of Abbott, who then decided on Morrison as sort of a compromise candidate heading into the 2019 elections, where the coalition were expected to lose handily. And because he was a quite brilliant campaigner, perhaps a better campaigner than Prime Minister, Scott Morrison surprised everyone and eked out a majority in the 2019 election. What have we seen since then? Well, we've seen Australia having possibly some of the most aggressive lockdown policies, and I think the coalition will be punished for that. I think that's part of a lot of, that's where Scott Morrison's shine really started to come off, especially when the vaccine rollout started well, but then sort of skidded off the tracks. Another issue that Morrison handled badly in his tenure of the last 3 years was bushfires that really destroyed large parts of Australia, especially the agricultural areas, not traditionally rich areas. And then, of course, we are up to the problem of inflation. The cost of living crisis is hitting home. And I must say, this is something that people must watch out for over the next few years. Incumbent governments are going to become massively unpopular. And where there are elections, that'll probably be the defeating factor for them. It almost did, well, not almost, but it came as close as doing it for Macron as Le Pen ever was able to, by her squarely going for the cost of living crisis. And Scott Morrison is likely to be the first world leader, a G7 leader, to be, as they say, rumbled by the cost of living crisis that he just couldn't get under control.
Yeah, I think that last point you made is very accurate. All the indications are that the Democrats are going to get absolutely smashed in the midterms in the US for similar reasons, which is that they're associated with the inflation problem. Chris, in 30 seconds or so, your thoughts on this? Do you have anything to add?
I don't think anything of real use or substance after Hermann's excellent summation, but just that, maybe places like Australia, India, South Africa, even, although some would say that the country is on an irretrievable way towards balkanization, but just where these places might be better testing grounds for liberalism than the quote-unquote geographical West, and see how these ideas and policies play out. I think it'll be interesting to see what happens.
Indeed. I think the last couple of years have been a pretty big shakeup for the world's politics. And I think that with inflation and big wars coming back, and maybe some big wars in the future, thinking China, Taiwan here, sort of political shakeups and incumbent governments unexpectedly falling and dominant parties cracking apart and breaking to 1,000 pieces. I think there's going to be a lot more of that going ahead, and South Africa is almost certainly going to be in that wave. Anyway, that's all the time we have for today. So thank you very much for listening. If you like the show, please subscribe to it. Please like the video. Please leave us good podcast ratings on the apps. Please do all the good things. Share the good word. We'd really appreciate that if you are a fan. And of course, we will see you next week on the Daily Friend Show. I hope you all have an excellent and wonderful weekend. Cheers, everyone.